Welcome everybody to Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation's Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. My name is Steve Weinberger. I'm the CEO of the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation. We are recording these sessions for the purposes of Clearwater Jazz Holidays education and outreach. Today's educator and guest musician is James Suggs. His topic is developing your own sound. Participants are muted during the sessions for the courtesy of the session, but you'll have an ability to ask questions using the chat feature or the raise your hand feature, and we'll make sure we get these questions and bring that to James's attention, and we can unmute you if you'd like to have a conversation with James as well. If you have specific topic requests for these sessions, please feel free to email them to info at clearwaterjazz.com, and we will try to make all these session topics available to you. If you go to clearwaterjazz.com/education, you will see all of the upcoming sessions brought to you by Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, engaging local Tampa Bay area musicians and educators to deliver these experiences at no cost. There is a session on virtually every topic, covering every instrument. And if you have been with us all along, we hope you have been enjoying these and finding value. We are happy to present them. James Suggs is with us again for his second session. James is special to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday community. He participates regularly in many of our outreach programs, including the Young Lions Jazz Master Sessions, the History of Jazz Outreach Program, and our My Journey with Jazz program. You can learn more about those programs on our website. James is a professional trumpet player currently living in St. Pete after spending 8 years living and playing in Argentina. James's resume is long and impressive. He started playing trumpet at the age of 9, and since that time his talents have taken him all over the world. He studied with some greats, played with many greats, and we think James is pretty great. We're lucky to have him with us today and as part of our programming. He received a master's degree in music jazz performance from USF and also serves as an adjunct professor there. To connect with James or learn more about James, please visit him on Facebook and be sure to check out his music wherever you stream music. James, welcome to Clearwater Jazz Holidays Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. The stage is all yours, my friend.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure, not just doing these sessions, which are awesome this time, this crazy time, but all the outreach programs and the festival. It's always a pleasure working with you guys, Steve. So I appreciate what you do and for having me here. So yeah, like Steve said, and like the link said, today's topic will be about developing your own sound. And, it's basically geared towards trumpet players because I know more about trumpet than any other instrument, but still I think that, other, vocalists or instrumentalists can kind of take what they can from hopefully from what I'm talking about. And also you can use it in life, finding your own voice. That's really what your sound, your individual sound is. It's we kind of throw that around in the music world a lot, but sometimes it's good to kind of sit down and think about exactly what sound is and why should it be unique, why should it be your own, and how can we develop it? Is there a way to actually get closer to that ideal sound in your head? So that's what I'm going to basically touch upon. Like I said, it's your personality. This is something very important. Picking up an instrument and playing it, it brings me back to when I first started playing when I was 9 years old. The only thing that I cared about was getting the notes out. That was the only thing. And I'm sure some of you can attest to that. At first you just want to make the instrument sound. That's it. And then once you get more and more into it, hopefully you start realizing how important funneling all of that down to your own personal sound is. So it's your personality. It's something that you want. You know, I always think if I'm playing down the street and someone's walking towards the place and they hear me, I want them to know exactly who's playing, because I love doing that. You know, whenever I'm listening to online radio or jazz radio, or it's on shuffle or whatever, Spotify. It's always cool to kind of say, who is that? Oh, I know that person because of their sound. And sound is very different. When working on sound, you need to separate it from the other things that we are working on as musicians to try to improve our skills. Technique, obviously, I'm doing another class later on, another day on technique, which is incredibly important, obviously. But sound, when working on sound, it's always important to divide and conquer, separate it. Don't worry about technique if you're working on your sound. Think about how to develop that sound. I always think of it as, you know, how we learned to speak. You know, as human beings, doesn't matter where you grew up, you learn from your environment, whether that be your parents or brothers and sisters or friends or teachers, or a mixture of all, which is probably more likely. For instance, when I was learning, I lived in Argentina, like Steve mentioned, and when I was learning Spanish, the most important tool for me was being around Spanish-speaking people. So I wasn't opening a book. I never took formal lessons, which I probably should go back and do that. But it was always about listening to what was going on, listening to their accents, their inflections, knowing whether, even if I didn't know what words they were saying, listening to if it was going up or it was going down, if they were happy or if they were sad. So these are also things that we can transfer musically, and it's important to think about. So the main thing I think where to start off is to go back to your listening collection. And I talk about listening a lot, and I'm doing a session with Dwayne White also about listening. It's super important because that's how we learn to develop a sound. So if you go back to your recording collection and you pick those musicians that you love, and I'm not talking about all the crazy licks that they play and the cool, you know, flashy, whatever. I'm talking about that initial sound, that, you know, they just hold a note and you are in heaven just listening to that one note, or just a simple phrase, you know, playing, if they could play a scale, and your favorite musician playing a scale is the most beautiful thing ever. That's what we're talking about. So go back to those musicians and think about which ones specifically are the ones that touch you sonically. For instance, and together with Steve, I put together a playlist that you can follow in the link here, Clearwater Jazz. And it's titled, I think, Jazz Trumpet Sound, something like that. But it's on the link. But, you know, so I listed a lot of my favorite trumpet players growing up and still to this day. And, you know, like I said, when I started playing, it wasn't about harmony. It wasn't about theory. It was about sound. That's the first thing that catches us usually. So yeah, so we're talking about Miles Davis. Miles had that sound. I mean, he could play. You know, he had this haunting sound. And then, of course, what's the most recognizable Miles type of sound? That's with this mute, right? Whether you realize it or not, the Harmon mute, that sounds a lot like this. Right? So, and even that, this, putting a mute in the end of your horn does not make you sound like Miles. Unfortunately, I've tried it, and it's not that easy. I'm still working on making it easy, but it's still a challenge. And if you listen to like Roy Eldridge, who is another classic trumpet player, he used to play a lot with a harmon mute, or Dizzy Gillespie used to play a lot with a harmon mute. They don't sound alike at all. They all have their individual sounds, and it doesn't matter if they put any kind of mute in the end of their horn, they're still going to sound like themselves. And that's what I want, and that's what you should want as well. Sounding like the end result is sounding like yourself, finding that sound. So let's go through the other list of trumpet players. Kenny Dorham, Lee Morgan, Clifford Brown, Freddie Hubbard, Wynton Marsalis, Chet Baker, Woody Shaw, Maynard Ferguson, Clark Terry, Lou Mitchell, and then some of the newer guys guys that are around today, that are on the scene. Ambrose, I can't pronounce his last name, but Jeremy Pelt, Roy Hargrove. I mean, the list is huge. These are a lot of my favorite sounds. So again, these are all on the list of the listening list on Spotify, the playlist. So go and check those guys out. So I picked specifically mostly ballads for each of those. An example of each of those that I just named, a ballad that they're playing. And I think with ballads, it's easier to kind of hone in on your sound. It's interesting. A lot of musicians are fearful, apprehensive, maybe a better word, to play a ballad, because you're laying it all out there. I mean, that's you. You're opening your heart. And the thing is, you have to figure out how you're going to make that sound individual and sound unique, because everyone's played body and soul, but there's so many different ways to make it your own, That's one way. Here's another way. Let's see if you can hear a difference. So there are so many different ways, and those are just two ways that I came up with. But I mean, there's millions of ways. So it's narrowing down your millions of ways that you've heard and you're working on, and coming to your own individual sound. So for instance, I mentioned the trumpet players that I love listening to, mainly because of their sounds. We're not talking about harmony or complex theory or any of that. We're talking about the basic color, the sound that they produce. So those guys that I just mentioned are some of my favorites. And of course, there are a lot of others, but we'll be here all day. I also think it's important to be honest with yourself and say, I love that sound, or I hate that sound. And not, if there are some trumpet players, for instance, now this might be controversial, but I'm going to name a few trumpet players some are legendary, that I'm not so crazy about their sound. That doesn't mean I'm not crazy about them as a trumpet player entirely, but we're talking about sound. So for instance, the great Dizzy Gillespie. Please don't throw anything at me. The great Dizzy Gillespie is phenomenal. I listen to him as much as possible. I've learned a lot, and I hope to learn much more from him. But I'm not going after his sound, because there are qualities in his sound that I'm not completely crazy about. Donald Byrd, who I love and have listened to since I was a kid. Also, there are a lot of recordings that I think, man, I love everything, but I'm not crazy about his sound. And that's okay. That's my individual taste, right? And that's important to realize, be honest with yourself and say, I love this because of this. I hate this or I dislike it because of these reasons. Some other trumpet players, Don Cherry, Booker Little. And then, you know, there's current players like, for instance, Leroy Jones. I love everything about him. His sound is quirky, and it's not a sound that I want to go after. I love hearing him play, but it's not something that I'm trying to incorporate sound-wise into my playing. So I'm being honest with myself. I'm not saying, oh, I have to like everything about this trumpet player because people say that I need to. I'm being very honest and really discerning. And I think that helps us get to the final product that we're looking for. So once you figure out what you like, make a list. And I'm talking about like really like, I'm all about making lists, like I mentioned them in the last class. Make lists, write what and who exactly you love about, you know, whose sound you love and what about that sound. For instance, vibrato. You know, that's something that we don't really talk about that often, but if you think about it, if you go back and listen to that playlist that I gave you, listen to each of their vibrato. For instance, I was talking about Miles Davis earlier, and he started off playing with a good amount of vibrato regularly, pretty consistently, which was pretty common back in that day, the big band era. So that might be right. That's nowhere near the way he played, but that's an example. So I'm adding a little vibrato, but what he ended up doing was playing hardly with any vibrato. Right. So if you think about it, really pay attention to what the note is doing. It's staying still, and that's a way to get closer to your sound. Do you want to play with vibrato? Go back and listen to it. Try different forms of playing vibrato. We think, you know, we attribute a lot of vibrato to the older style of playing. Right. And there's even some, like, it gets into, it's so much vibrato, it gets into kind of like going to another note, you know, like kind of a lip slur kind of thing. So that's one style. If that's what you're going after, if that's what you love, pay attention to the players that play exactly like that. Go back and dissect each little nuance of their playing. Try to copy exactly what they're doing. If their vibrato is going really fast, now also another thing, for instance, when I was playing with the Glenn Miller Orchestra, it wasn't just learning how to read the notes and play a quarter note like a quarter note and cut off at, you know, it wasn't just that, which was a big part of it, but it was also the vibrato. I had to match the exact vibrato as the other three trumpet players, not to mention the whole band. So a lot of things, the way they would approach it, which was new to me, was starting off with a stagnant note and then adding the vibrato after. So I'm going to demonstrate that. Right? So that's another way of doing it. It doesn't have to be immediate. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't even have to be any at all. But that is a choice that you have to decide in order to get closer to your own sound. Again, if there are any questions, please feel free to type them in, and Steve will let me know. But you know, don't hold off on asking questions, please. So yeah, think about these nuances, these qualities. For instance, I grew up listening to Wynton Marsalis, and one of his qualities is how he approaches some notes. It's not always it's a lot of times. So that first note, I started on another note and I kind of glissed up to it, a glissando up to that C. And then I did a chromatic run down to the A. Let me do it again. So that's, you know, if you start off listening to an awesome trumpet player or whoever you idolize, if you love their sound, this is the kind of dissection that needs to happen. So being as obsessive and nitpicky as possible and tearing apart everything. I'm talking about one measure. I'm talking about the first note of a ballad, for instance, trying to copy that note, listen to it, sing it, and then pick up your instrument and try to copy it and figure out exactly what they're doing, because that's the way you're going to get closer. If you love that sound and that approach so much, that's the best way to start this journey on getting closer to your own sound. So yeah, and then also you there's some players that really, you know, Louis Armstrong was one of the first to do that kind of thing. So there's some players that really kind of milk those, you know, glissandos and those bends. Also, we're talking about Louis Armstrong. Right? A lot of handshakes, not handshakes, but hand shaking the trumpet. So focus on that, and where does he put those shakes? If you really love his sound, figure out why you love it. Tear it down, break it down. Let's see. Also, let's talk about size of the sound. I'm always, you know, most of the trumpet players that I listed on my list, and you know, most of the trumpet players that I love because of their sound, it's because of they play with a huge sound. And you know, honestly, it's hard to put things like this into words, because some people think maybe this person has a huge sound, someone thinks they have a small sound. It's all perspective. But I hear a lot of students that are having trouble getting their own sound because they're playing with too small of a sound. And I don't know if this will transfer, if you can hear, but let me try to play with a small sound and see if you can hear that. Right? So that, I don't know if you can hear that, but imagine a small sound, if you can. So you know, I always talk about this is specifically to trumpet. If your sound you're realizing is too small, that means that this apparatus, this aperture, is too closed. Your lips are too close together, or something. You know, maybe your tongue is, you know, taking up too much space. So I always think of oh, whoa, right? Opening up everything, whoa. And when I'm doing that, inside my mouth is the cavity is getting bigger, and also I'm dropping my jaw, whoa. So it goes from a small sound to a big sound. Right? So I work on that a lot, making sure that I'm not getting lazy, because what I personally want is a nice big sound. So I don't want to get lazy and try to press my lips together. I want to keep them apart, making the vibration, but still trying to have that open sound, that aw sound, because those are the kind of sounds that I'm going after. So one way, you know, other ways of broadening your sound is with the mouthpiece. My teacher in Argentina talked a lot about working with mouthpieces before you kind of pick up the trumpet. You know, I can talk. I'm doing the lesson on technique. So we'll talk more about that. then, but so yeah, you can hear that immediately. I always say the mouthpiece, these are things that my teacher in Argentina taught me. The mouthpiece is where the sound comes from. The trumpet is just a sometimes very expensive amplifier. That's really all it is. So if you can make a good sound, the closest sound to a trumpet with your mouthpiece, then you're on the right step, right? So again, back to the small sound. Right? There's a lot of funky things happening right there because my lips are so close together. Now, if I'm going to relax and open up everything, so it's big, it's fat, and it's the closest thing to a trumpet sound that I can do. That's my goal when I pick up the mouthpiece. Of course, when I'm, I've been trying to get up early these days and, keep myself on schedule and warm up and do the routine and practice, and some days it's so hard to get the lips moving. But this, at first it'll sound really bad, I assure you. But then, the more and more you do it and thinking about moving the air and opening up everything, the better it'll sound. That's a big fat sound. So that's the first step. And then I put the mouthpiece on the trumpet, and then I kind of have that sensation. My body kind of knows, all right, I'm going to follow that lead that the mouthpiece helped me with. Long tones as well, note bending. Think about these things, how you're moving the air. So for instance, another thing I do to kind of get my sound big in the morning when I'm, warming up is I do long tones, and I also do note bending. So I'm not moving any valves, it's all with the air. Right? So what I'm doing is I'm working on flexibility. I'm trying to kind of, when you before you go out for a run, you have to stretch, you have to kind of, get everything ready and opened up. And that's what I'm trying to do as well. I'm trying to give myself more of a chance to make a good sound on the horn. And if I kind of push the limits by moving the sound up and down, then I can kind of center in right in the middle. And that's where I want to be. Sometimes trumpet players play kind of above the note. It doesn't really speak, or sometimes they play a lot, way too under the note. So that affects intonation, that affects flexibility, that affects precision, all these important things that we need coming back to sound. So if we can get that out of the way first in the day, starting off the practice session or the warm-up routine session like that, then we can deal with other things. But I think getting that sound, that initial sound together every day is very important. So going back to these classic recordings, and everyone's recordings are different. If you don't want to tell your best friend what your favorite recordings are because you're embarrassed that you actually love whoever, it doesn't matter. You can, this is private. You can do it on your own. But the important thing is getting inside, listening to these recordings as much as possible, being obsessive, making that list of the things that you love about each of these, the specific things that you love about each of these people's sounds. And then starting to kind of mix it together. So first, what we do usually is we copy. You want to be an exact copy. That's what I used to do with Wynton Marsalis recordings. I started listening to him when I was about 10 or 11. And I didn't know much about the trumpet at all. I didn't have much technique at all. I couldn't transcribe his solos. I didn't even try. But what I did try was try to mimic his sound and the way he played. I remember he on one recording he played "How Are Things in Glockamora," an old standard. Right. So I didn't know what notes where they were. I didn't know what key I was in. I didn't know what harmony was happening theoretically wise. But I could try to copy each note, the vibrato, the little nuances that he was adding. That was my goal. And that got me closer to getting to my sound, my own personal sound. So the idea is first to copy these legendary musicians, those sounds that you love, and then little by little forming your own sound. So it ends up being like, like if you're in the kitchen and, you're trying that chili for the 15th time, make chili for the 15th time. This time you put way too much salt in and, the whole pot is kind of ruined. You eat it because you have to, but, next time you don't put as much salt in, you put too much cayenne pepper. So now it's just a matter of kind of mixing and matching the right amount, right? You don't want too much salt or cayenne. You want the right mixture of sounds into your sound. And then all of a sudden you'll have your own sound. It's very interesting that, if you look at the lineage of, the jazz trumpet tree, family tree, Louis Armstrong came from King Oliver. He, young Louis Armstrong sounded just like King Oliver. And then he became Louis Armstrong. Roy Eldridge sounded like Louis Armstrong and then became Roy Eldridge. Dizzy Gillespie sounded like Roy Eldridge and then it became Dizzy Gillespie. And it just happened, on and on, nonstop. And that's how we have to be too. You find those players or player and mimic their sound until you find your own sound, which will happen. I guarantee you.
Hey James, I have a question for you. Um, when you think about the different opportunities available to an aspiring professional musician, whether it be playing with a group or session work, does it ever become important to be able to describe your own sound to others?
That's a very interesting question. I never actually thought about it. I don't know if it's necessary to describe my individual sound. What I'm talking about is the sound that if I were to step on the stage and play a concert, the music I've chosen, or basically in the jazz idiom, that would be my approach, my sound you would be hearing. But for instance, if I were to walk into a recording session and they wanted me to sound like, I don't know, they wanted a horn section, a typical horn section, maybe like a Earth, Wind and Fire kind of approach. My goal right now is to put in that Earth, Wind and Fire chip and try to get as close to that as possible. So sometimes this is really common, I think, to kind of offshoot your question, is sometimes I get called for recordings or for performances where they say, I need a trumpet to sound exactly like fill in the blank. And then I have to go and say, either I have to go back and research and try to get as close as possible to that sound, or I have to go back into my memory bank and say, okay, I think it's like this. For instance, someone called me to do a kind of like a spaghetti Western soundtrack thing, and my first thought was, all right, from what I remember, it sounds something like this. Right? Or it can also also like a Spanish kind of thing, like a lot of vibrato and really kind of. So, I don't know if this really answers your question, but it's hard to describe my own sound, but I can describe my influences. But it is kind of easy if someone wants me to specifically record something in a specific style. I need that blank to be filled. Tell me exactly who I need to sound like, and I will try my best to sound like that person or style. So yeah, let's see. For instance, like what I was saying about, trying to imitate and then go and find your own sound. There's a video out there of Lee Konitz, who just passed, and he's on stage, and he's talking about when he was coming up, and every saxophone player wanted to play like Charlie Parker, and a lot of them came really close. I mean, they devoted their lives to playing exactly like Charlie Parker. For instance, Sonny Stitt would be confused a lot. They'd hear Sonny and they'd think it's Charlie Parker, or vice versa. But the story is Lee Konitz, the famous alto player, was talking to Charlie Parker after hanging out for years, and he said, "Man, finally, you don't sound like me." And he was congratulating him that he moved on. He was imitating for so long like everyone else, and then finally he came into his own sound, and Charlie Parker couldn't be more thrilled. So that's important, to move on and find your own sound and stick with it. When I was working on my sound, typically, I guess in high school, but mainly in undergrad, were the moments where I really started to think about sound. And I go to the practice room and I turn off the light, or I love, if I can get away with it, I close my eyes anytime I practice or perform, because that's kind of like zeroing in on our sound. A lot of times we think about all the mechanics of playing the instrument, and I think it's really important to kind of just zone in on the voice that we have. I think, unfortunately, sound ends up being kind of put on the back burner because we have to learn our skills, we have to learn technique, we have to play better than this person. But a true, nice, beautiful, personal sound really is priceless.
We've got about maybe just a couple minutes left. As you kind of think about some final thoughts, let me remind everybody that you're going to be back with us on June 3rd,
Mm.
and your topic is improving your technique. And then on June 10th, you're back with us with Dwayne White on a topic that you're calling Why Listening to Music is Important. So we're definitely looking forward to having you continue to participate with us on these sessions. And I also wanted to remind everyone that on the education and outreach section of our website, clearwaterjazz.com/education, you can see all these upcoming sessions. Tomorrow, for instance, there is a packed day. Starting at 3 p.m., we have Butch Thomas with us on saxophone, who's focusing on a daily practice regimen for the serious player. And then at 4:30, Tyler Wortman and Frank Williams are back on their basic trombone fundamentals series. And at 5:30, we have Mark Feynman with us on drums, the quarter note system, a rhythmic guide to creativity, with a bunch of more great topics next week and into June. So please visit that page and see if anything else strikes your fancy, and join us. All of these lessons are free, brought to you by Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, and we thank all of our supporters for helping to continue this programming, particularly during these challenging times, including the Al Downing Tampa Bay Jazz Association and other friends of ours like the Pinellas Realtor Organization. Means a lot. And so we really appreciate you being with us and part of this, James. And I'll leave it to you to kind of conclude with some final thoughts and sign us out.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Once again, it's a pleasure being here and working with you. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to the next few sessions, not just my own and shared with Dwayne, but also checking out others. It's so cool hearing my buddies talk and about what they do, because we don't really do that very often. We don't talk about the basics and what's needed to get from point A to point B. So it's always cool to tune into these sessions. And I'm looking forward to the ones coming up. But so I'll be talking about improving your technique, which I think, unfortunately, especially jazz trumpet players, we kind of think that it's separated. They're two different techniques. And so I've been trying to find that link, and studying at USF and now teaching there, that's helpful in getting those two together, to link those two. And then talking about listening as well with Dwayne White. So yeah, back to listening. Make sure you check out the playlist that I made on Spotify. The link is there. We were listening to it today, and it's just such beautiful music. And it's cool hearing how much I love each of those trumpet players and their sounds, but they're all so different. So see if you can figure out what makes them different. Just simple terms and simple ideas to describe their differences. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.